Welcome to the end of September. Happy Friday, all. So what we have, we're going to do our third episode of our Everfox LinkedIn Live series for insider risk centered topics. We just did Clay and I did a episode 2 months ago covering the 10 things we hate about insider risk programs. Obviously, we don't hate insider risk, or else we wouldn't be here. And then last month, Clay was joined by John Besco from GDIT, where they talked about insider risk program building, also the critical pathway for insider risk and other topics as well. Today, we're really excited to close out the end of September. So for those that don't know, September is a significant month for insider risk because it's a National Insider Threat Awareness Month, which is also celebrated in Canada as Canadian Insider Threat Awareness Month. And then there's also kind of a global campaign, so Global Insider Threat Awareness Month. So another thing that coincides with September and not Insider Threat Awareness Month is National Suicide Prevention Awareness Month as well, which is a topic that's very important to all of us, especially to Dr. Briggs and Mike Hudson, who will be introducing here shortly. So really quickly, my name is Shibu Thomas. I'm the field CTO here at Everfox for our insider risk programs, and I've been here for 19 years as of last month. And I'm joined by Dr. Liza Briggs, Mike Hudson, and Clay Drye. So let's do some quick intros here. Dr. Briggs, would you mind starting us off with a quick intro on yourself?
I first must say, I apologize. I have some sort of an allergy, so I'm talking a bit froggy. But I have been working in the insider threat risk space since 2011 as a social scientist. And people often are asking, well, what does that actually mean? And the social scientist's primary role, I would say the umbrella type of perspective, is to bridge people with their programs, their mission, and their objectives. And so in the insider threat space, that usually involves making connections or standing between organizations' culture and what they're trying to accomplish in terms of reduction of threat and risk, helping them with decisions related to that, and more specifically from that behavioral point of view, helping them look at behaviors and put them in the appropriate context so that they can do risk reduction much better. So that's kind of the short version of what I've been doing for a while. Lots of really interesting research projects along the way. I have one that I've been working on that I'm still quite passionate about that has to do with the link between online gaming behaviors and insider risks. So other than that, I'm really happy to be here, and I look forward to talking more about wellness and topics that we kind of field during our call.
That's awesome. Mike, would you please do an intro for us as well?
Sure. I echo Dr. Briggs. Great to be here. Appreciate the opportunity from Team Everfox. Hi, Mike Hudson. My background really started in law enforcement until the Marine Corps made you that offer you couldn't refuse. So then I flew helicopters for 30 years. I retired as a colonel, had an opportunity to command a helicopter squadron and then go on to command what we call Marine Expeditionary Unit. When not flying, I had an opportunity to do some counterterrorism and counterintelligence type work. Now I'm the vice president for ClearForce. It is a insider risk human analytics company based in Virginia that focuses on data and data compliance. And I also work for and run our suicide prevention. So it's great to be here.
Thanks, Mike. Clay?
Yeah, I'm Clay Drye. I've been with Everfox as an engineer and an insider threat SME for just over 4 years. I've worked in the insider risk community for over 20 years, mostly operationally, starting out in the intelligence community, DoD, and a little bit of industry as well. And I'm excited to have this conversation as well.
Yeah, no, we're very excited about this. And Liza and Mike and I, we get to talk every other week because we are part of the ATARC Insider Risk Working Group as well. Don't remember the acronym for ATARC anymore, so apologize for that. But no, we're really enjoying the conversation so far and wanted to get us going here. So I think the first topic that we were going to kind of cover is insider risk program trust. That's a big topic, right? So, going to different events, talking to different people about insider, there's a it can be kind of a taboo subject sometimes to certain people when they hear about it that are not in the spaces like we are. Would you like to address that first? Maybe Dr. Briggs, would you like to touch on that one first when it comes to monitoring and insider risk in general in the workplace?
Yes, like so many things, trust is like a foundational portion of it. And one of the things that I think about when I use that word or talk about it in the construct of or the context of threat and risk reduction is how do you build it? What does it mean? And who's trusting whom? Like how does that? There's a vibe, there's a directional piece to it. There's we trust you and do you trust us? And I think sometimes the narrative tends to be we're doing this, so trust us, and not the other way around. What have you done to engender the trust? And that's something that has to be taken into consideration when we're trying to do the work. Is understanding that trust goes two ways, and what have you done to get their trust, and what are they expecting? Like why or how should that trust happen? And one way to do that, at least in my experience, is the best of folks has to do with a lot of transparency and a lot of communication and also training and awareness. And so I'll stop there. I'm sure Mike has some things to color in that sort of bit or some other things to add.
Yeah, I think Dr. Briggs, that bidirectional trust is an important component. I think I just pick up on for those on the call that have been working on what insider risk, it kind of started as insider threat. If you think through where the executive order out of President Obama that kind of kicked all this off, it was an insider threat type focus. But as the conversation, as Dr. Briggs just articulated, you can't show up and say we're looking for a threat. So if you do get an alert or concerning behavior, you're already kind of crossing over by calling that person a threat. So I think looking at even just that name change, insider risk, I think gets a lot of what Dr. Briggs is articulating. And I think the other part I would add to that is, I mean, organizationally, this is, and kind of what our topic is, connecting into employee wellness to some degree, is that ability to have a program that picks up on risk signals that are associated with organizational policy, that's that foundational component. So these aren't random. It's actually what the organization, term of your employment, reporting requirements, things of that nature. And then you're going to go forward is, I mean, the leadership has a duty of care to set a safe and secure environment so the organization and their people there can flourish. So I think that the idea of trust is super important in this conversation, specifically bidirectional.
No, that's great, Clay. I think you've had your hand in a couple of programs. I'm sure you'd have some great insights here as well.
Well, I do. I did want to bring up from that trust perspective. I know, like Liza said, well, trust us. We're here to help, right? And at the end of the day, how do you balance that? If you go back, we have spies or and issues we've had with employees who left an employer or the government because they were concerned that they were going to have something bad happen because they were having some kind of issue or a wellness problem or whatever. And the point now is programs are trying to get them to trust them, to say, look, if you come to us, we will help you. And so I think an important part there, and what I've seen is when you take proportional responses, when you find an issue, even if they didn't come to you with it, you take a proportional response and in that way you build that clear indication that, hey, we're here to help. And I recall I even had an instance I dealt with where we took a proportional response to a very alarming issue, but the person you're dealing with always gets to tell the story, and it appeared we may have overreacted, and so we had to carefully manage the conversation with the population to say, look, understand this person wasn't walked out for doing their job. They were, there was a risk that we needed to deal with, and we wanted to make sure we handled it correctly while protecting both them and the population.
That's awesome. Yeah, those are great responses, guys. Clay, I think you were gonna. We have the next one there.
Well, I know General, last week, Liza, when we spoke, you talked about culture, and I really enjoyed that you provide a definition of culture that I really liked what you had to say about that. So if you don't mind.
I'll squawk it out. I am a cultural anthropologist, And one of the things I say is that if you get anthropologists together, there is no definition of culture. Even though people who made and committed their lives to it, spent a lot of money, degrees to understand it. The one that served me really well, especially in applied settings versus like a research or theoretical leaning, is to think of it as the collective habits of the heart, mind, body, and spirit of a thing. And the thing can be an organization, could be your home, could be a social group, could be a group of people with collective sense of something that they call religion or things like that. In the workforce, it's the collective habits of the heart, mind, body of the whatever organization you plug in. And it shows through in the way they talk, the things they do, how they're organized physically. You can look in a space and learn about culture, what they have on their walls, what they wear, the jokes they tell, how they operate, their org plans, their mission statements. All of those tell the story of an organization's culture. And when those things align is where you see a lot more ability to get things done in an organization. And alignment is not easy. It takes a long time and a lot of work. And it's a constant. You don't get there and then stop. You're always working to keep alignment, to try to keep everything together. As you shift, as your population shifts, you still have to stack and have everything moving towards alignment so that you're all on the same page or singing from the same page of music, or there's some saying like that that fits there. But that's kind of what I see when I try to talk about culture in an applied setting.
I think that's really good. And what I would add to an organization as you're building out your programs and just the broader definition that Dr. Briggs put out, it becomes like a countermeasure or an antibody to the negative influence. If the organization feels connected, if the organization, back to bidirectional trust, now you take a look at it and go, well, these insider risk programs are really designed to set a safe and secure organization, vice a better mousetrap. So when you start to see tenets of that, like no bias or favoritism, you can articulate that. They can see that in the execution. That drives to some level of transparency in the programs. I mean, a lot of counterintelligence or insider risk people will very quick tell you, I can't tell them what I'm doing because otherwise they'll know I'm watching them and therefore they'll have a way to prevent me from finding them. That is a way to think through it. And there are some particular jobs or bullet descriptions that may fall into that. But I think broadly, organizationally, back to Dr. Briggs' culture, I think it can be a really good bulwark to reduce risk. If the organizational culture is one where people feel like, hey, I think Dr. Briggs is struggling today, and say that without like, stitches get or snitches get stitches kind of mentality, right? That idea that, no, I'm trying to contribute to the overall wellness of the organization. And I know Dr. Briggs and I both spent some time with the Marines, but it's this idea of individual resiliency will drive organizational capability and readiness. And I think that's that important, but it starts at that individual level. And I think the culture can be a solid foundation for that.
So you touched on, trust and culture, but you've mentioned twice now, Mike, transparency. And while, yes, proportional responses and all of that are very important, I've found operationally transparency to be quite difficult because of what you said, where you don't want to tell them programs. So could you share more thoughts on how you can have that transparency without kind of giving up the goat, so to speak?
Yeah, I think there's strategically, I would think about the organization has good policy. So the first thing that you're going to describe when the employee joins the team, besides the operational, where we're going, what your job function is, is kind of that, what's the expectation of your performance within the work environment, right? To Dr. Briggs' point, don't be bringing in posters or pictures or having conversations that are like super political. That we're not here to do that. We're here to, develop a technology or to make a change significant in the way the world thinks about something. That's a really good mission you can bond around. Vice, what will happen is you get microcultures that can break out. But transparency is where the organization says, hey, this is how I'll be treated. This is what my requirement to the team, right, through the policies. And then if there is an investigation, Clay, you said to your point a little bit, you walk that person out. It's the idea that you do training consistently. You talk about what the standards are. You're fair in the execution of that. And then if you do have an insider risk program, which organizations should have, then there is the ability for that to be audited. There is a really good way you can use to protect that individual's privacy, who is the subject, use the right type of technology and thinking to buy down false positives again. So you're not just trying to play, find me nail because I got a hammer model. So I think transparency really is a leadership thing at the top, but it kind of flows back through the strata of the organization down to the subunit leaders. They can have a conversation. So if I pick up on data that says, hey, Clay, maybe you're struggling a bit, I can have a conversation with you that isn't punitive or, hey, Clay, step it up. I can come in and say, let's get coffee. What's going on? That to me is that level that begins to flush out that conversation.
Yeah, I love that. See, Lisa, did you have something to add to that? It seemed like you were really saying something.
Dr. Briggs, we're not hearing you. Sorry.
That's where that coordinating function of kind of having a working group of people across the organization in different working units comes to bear. For me, at least when I look at an organization that's doing best practices when it comes to engagement and transparency and aligned with sort of pushing and helping scale the insider threat mission, I would look for something happening the minute someone hit the door. Any type of new employee orientation should have components where they're hearing the words and you're strategically communicating about insider threats. Are you hitting the button of potential risk indicators so that your people know what they're expected to do? Like, to get to Mike's point about what are the expectations? Are you talking to them about monitoring? Are you messaging around the topic of we're not here to hurt you, we're here to help? From an insider threat risk perspective, program perspective, are you touching on the notion of this is not, big brother's watching you, it's we're helping each other. And here's how you can help. Here's our ask for you, so that you're giving them ownership of the components of the program that will help it scale. And then you're introducing yourself to them and giving them a face. You're telling them where they can go. And you're addressing really subtle topics that are emerging, like perhaps less trust for organizations and institutions that could lead someone to think that it's okay to disclose information, which is something that is an emerging trend that we know through research about, especially younger people. There's a mistrust for government thing. And I'm not saying that everybody who's younger has it, but it's a thing. And so talking about those things as they are relevant to your given organization from the beginning and opening the door for that exchange and that back and forth are part of how you posture your program for success and how you sort of make real the things that Mike just talked about. Absolutely. Great idea.
Yeah, spot on. I'm going to just go a step further. I think that's really good. One of the best practices that you'll see in varsity insider threat programs across organizations, regardless whether you're in the clear defense industry or in the commercial space, is the idea of an integrated team approach. And so that is, I think, to what Dr. Briggs was articulating, is HR involved in that program? Are they on the same sheet of music with legal and compliance, ethics? So you look organizationally and you start to see the synergy, the silos are broken down. Now you have a whole of organizational response. And I would just tease out maybe one little thing that maybe takes us down a different rabbit hole, but EAP, I do some work in the HR space. And what you find a lot of times is if you talk to the HR professionals and you ask them, how much of your employee assistance program do you deploy annually? The average is somewhere around 10 or 12%. So you have all this capacity that is the organization set aside. They want to be able to use these resources, but the fear is, and this is where culture helps, I'm not knocking on HR's door and say, hi, I could use a little help, for fear of all the blowback. But if you have that culture at the varsity level, then that's not there. Or back to if Clay and I just go get coffee, Clay can say, hey, Mike, why don't you go talk about HR? They got some capability I think that might help you right now. And you do that in a way that's positive. And this goes back to the idea of reinforcing trust within the organization. And I have one other bullet, I'll toss it in here, is we talk about, I think there's a difference between monitoring and surveillance. It's like a monitoring program to me is consent-based. The individuals are aware. There's some level of telling you what we're doing. Like in Everfox, as we're deploying a UAM technology, we're using that to pick up on protect. You kind of describe the why you're doing that. Now there may be some, trade secrets you hold back just a little bit there, but the concept that they know that there's a monitoring idea. Surveillance is totally different in my view. Surveillance is the employee is unaware that this is being done. There was probably no consent captured, and they're just using the data to find a reason to hold you accountable. That's a different model. I think monitoring and surveillance is an important delta.
Those are great points. Actually, they're very timely too. Both those first two topics that we've discussed so far are very timely in the sense that, like, even this week and last week, but this week especially, I was speaking at an event, and one of the questions that came up on the sidebar was, it was almost in a facetious way that the person asked it to me, but like, hey, we vet our employees. We have people that are being monitored in government and military that have clearances and things like that. Like, what's the need for insider risk programs when people are vetted and clearances are issued and things like that. So would you guys like, I know we pretty much touched on all those, but any last comments about that specific question that would come up about monitoring and vetted and trusted employees, and again, just staying on that same topic there, that same vein?
Want to go first?
Yeah, I'll shoot first because I think you're going to be way better at cleaning this one up. It's I'll kind of take a point of what you articulated in the cleared industry. So we'll go there. There are the 13 adjudicative guidelines that are currently being used to determine someone's suitability for access. And so once you receive that, so we'll call that the vetting. They are vetted through the 13 adjudicative guidelines. They are then found suitable for access, and access is granted at the appropriate level of that suitability finding, right? If I'm getting those terms correctly. But the part then becomes the thresholds for reporting of those tend to be when you cross them, you have done something wrong. So there's this huge amount of trade space below that threshold. So as an example, if you get a DUI, that's reportable. And if you get pulled over for maybe running a stoplight, it's probably not. But if you did 5 of those, then maybe there's patterns of behaviors, back to this idea of the purpose of the program, and to stay with just one narrow criminal activity. An organization that sees these lower level issues that don't cross a threshold to begin an investigation, right? They're below the investigative thresholds, but they could be square in the middle of your cultural organization. We're here to help. So you pick up on lower level. Financial is another great one. Matter of fact, that's one of the leading reasons that tragically people will die by suicide. It's one of the leading reasons you will lose your security clearance. It's one of the leading reasons that drives to interpersonal violence, workplace violence. You look at even Dr. Shaw's critical pathway model under stressors, it's usually the first or second one. It can be the grievance model and pathway to violence. But the point of all that is, and I know I'm tossing out a ton of data, but I like the idea of working in the trade space below what is investigatable. That's a program that is designed to actually get at resiliency and help people, because you pick up on those low risk. And this, I think, is an area that a lot of insider threat programs currently have a blind spot.
To that, you can hear me, yep. Is that, yes, we have programs, we have things in place that could tell us when people do things like try to send something they shouldn't. Send something out of the organization. We can catch people doing quite a few things. But the thing with the insider threat program, and to that person who asked the question's point, is that one like workspace for the insider threat, insider risk concept is to be left of loss, harm, and damage. And to do that requires a different set of tools. The tools that we have mostly don't really do that. They tell you, they cover down to protect you so that you can cut the system, shut someone's access down, but they don't do the helping part. So if we're selling help, if we're selling protecting the community and working together to collectively reduce risk, our tools need to also do that. And tools are the technical sides of things, where you can look at indicators and know that someone might have a pattern or something based on the things they're saying, but also the tools include reporting. And I can't emphasize how important that is and how it goes hand in hand with technology and technological tools. You need both most times. And a lot of times folks are interested in getting a package of something, plugging it in and saying, I've got the insider threat risk space covered. And it's much more than that. That will only get you, as one of my favorite program managers used to say, 1/6 of 1/6 of what you need to be able to address the problem sets. You have to have the other piece. And if you said in the beginning, for consistency and cultural alignment, that we care about you and we want to do these things and we're going to come out, then your actions must match what you say in that left of loss space. And that's how you also balance the whole monitoring and surveillance thing. Because if you're doing the left of loss and you're showing with your responses that you're not just there to catch people or catch them doing something wrong, then you will build the trust. The proof is in the actions and the behaviors. So that's what I would tell the person asking that question about why we need it. It's because that left of loss space isn't really covered well yet. We can do more in terms of the threat risk part of it. So that's my response.
Well,
I think that's awesome. Yeah. Sorry, Sue. I think just to add to that, this idea, the way I like to think about it is, what is the technology? What are the data sets that you're including? What are the analytical processes with all the safeguards associated with it? And then the humans that are engaged in that loop. So it's not a complete, AI circle thing that spits out something out of a black box. it has human touch to it. And I think that's a little bit what I'm hearing Dr. Briggs articulate.
So I'd like to add on, talking about using all your tools and actually bringing it back to Mike when you said integrated, the integrated approach, with small companies, especially if you build the right culture, like everyone, it's a family, right, or whatever, right? And everyone's comfortable. But as you become medium to large, or if you're dealing in a government organizations that tend to be big, one thing I've seen be incredibly effective as one of those tools is, having like kind of deputized forward deployed personnel, or maybe you've got a situation where maybe some of your security personnel are forward deployed, but they become a trusted part of that workforce where, and I've seen it happen where stuff that there's no way anyone would mention to HR, there's no way they would call an agent, a special agent and say, hey, I'm thinking about hurting someone, right, or whatever. But they've got that trusted person who's around the office all the time and talks to them and keeps them up to date on things, and they'll go to them and say, hey, Johnny, he's been acting weird, like maybe you want to look at him, and that is a tool for getting that information incorporated. And as long as we use that, the medium to large organizations or small use that and respond proportionally, it helps to build that great culture and trust to continue being able to help those those personnel.
I think that's right. And that's a lot of the work I know Dr. Briggs has done, is that building out that, like from my 30 years in the Marine Corps, towards the end there, we were picking up on that. We obviously always use chaplains as that person you can engage with. And then we had the MFLACs, because you can imagine then over pressure and stress that, service members were under there, and like that, we had a period of almost 23 years of sustained combat. So that was having that ability to engage. Now, a lot of times HR owns that component, but this really goes back to, we could go way off topic on this, but the difference between managers and leaders, right? I mean, leaders inspire people. Leaders are, open door. Managers keep the trains on time. An important component and a requirement, but in some cases, they just don't have the people skills. And that's why when I was mentioning earlier, your technology, your data, your compliance, and then the people, you want that to the degree you can. And if you're a really good manager and people aren't your skill set, then you need to have a way to, just shunt that over to what I think Clay, you just articulated. Who's the person that should be having that conversation?
No, yeah, those are great points. But Lisa, were you going to say something?
They say that there are those points where people go, and then there are the natural places where people go. In every organization, whether you have an established or designated person, there are people who people go to. They attract people. In the military, it's kind of prescribed. You can go by rank in enlisted forces, and everyone knows that this is where everyone goes to tell all of their business. And that happens in other organizations that are not military as well. And if I were in a program and asked to try to figure out how to get those people to bring information or have them trained so they know how to report effectively, I would message to that point. I would talk to the issue of how, or speak strategically. I know there are folks you talk to, you feel comfortable. Hey, that person may be overwhelmed and have too much information. If you're that person, let us know. Share, report. There's always little injects that you can put in that speak to how things really work, that you can use to sort of elevate your message and your mission in terms of getting people to report or getting information reported. So I'll leave that with that.
No, that's great. No, actually, and this is a great segue into our next topic. And I think this might hit a lot more onto what you were talking about before, Dr. Briggs, about the research and the work that you've been doing recently regarding the video games and things like that. So basically, what we'll be talking about in this one is generational or personality variability and how wellness issues may be expressed and mitigated. So I think that's a great continuation onto what we were just talking about. And I'd love to hear personally, at some point, what you've been doing with that research and maybe how that would integrate into this topic here.
We have to talk. Yes, at least the research that I did really looked at gaming as a vector for risk, and it has a generational component because different cohorts, and I don't believe that you can simply just tell me your age and I'll tell you what you do on games. It's not that strict, but there is a general progression, and we know through the research that younger people game more than older people, but all people game. People game all the way up until the 70s, and 80-year-olds game. They're all gaming. And I make a distinction between gaming and just being online. So my research was specifically on gaming. And so they have different habits and patterns. Now, I can talk about that in another session more explicitly, but it's that notion that different cohorts do different things that I think is relevant to the question that you really asked. And there are patterns and variations with things that have something to do with how people feel and their wellness. And I would say that's one of the generalizations that we made is that younger generations have an experience a bit more anxiety and technology and how people interface with technology that makes it different from them in public spaces. But again, that's a whole segue as well. So that's a difference. And so that interface, interpersonal stuff, not being remote and having to engage in real time in office settings can be different for people who are younger in general than for older people who may have had some discomfort, but over the years in the workforce, they've had to figure out how to do that better because they've been on site. And so folks who haven't had to, who engage a lot online, it's a different set of variables for them in terms of how they negotiate that space. And so when we look at stressors, anxiety, and interpersonal dynamics, there's a difference. Some of that is not just age-based, it's also experience-based, as I hinted to, because you can have anxiety, but you've been working so long, you know how to do it, and you're new, you're 25 years old, and you're not that experienced in the workforce setting with workforce culture. So all of those variances will have to do with how, make an impact on how people feel, how they engage. And it's not just how they feel, it's how they interact with others. Even things like dressing. Millennials, by research, were the ones who really helped shift workforce culture to be more casual in the office. So even though you can have older people saying, look at how they dress, they wear, khakis and they do this and they do that. Quietly in the research, people are happy that they don't have to dress like they used to. But you can also go to an environment and see people suited up and then younger people wearing more casual gear. Those are all differences that have a place in terms of how people interact in the workforce, how people perceive one another. And that also impacts how well people feel and how accepted they feel in the work environment. So there's a lot to that we have to consider. And if you're a good organization that's aware, you can incorporate some of that in how you talk to people. I think a lot of places have open dress codes now and dress policies. And even if they have a policy, it doesn't mean that there's still not judgment and different feelings about folks. And typically the older people have the higher positions and can make more decisions. So there's kind of a look at you or look at these people kind of dynamic that we see in the workforce. So lots of things to think of there. I'll just stop with that and let's see what else we do with that particular question stream.
First thing I'm going to do is point out that the old guy does not have a tie on. So I feel like I'm bridging generations here, just so we're clear. I think that whole conversation to me is super fascinating, which is why it's Dr. Briggs and just, Colonel Hudson. But I like the idea of thinking it through that lens. And I think Dr. Shaw's critical pathway is a great example of kind to take that and operationalize it. Because if you think of the critical pathway, a model and insider risk program that's used inside and out of the government, the idea that first step is what's those prepositions? What does this individual bring when they do that initial vetting? And I think to some degree that millennial, and I use the term not just being a particular group of people, but maybe over time, I think that's an important way to consider that person that comes on board, because they're going to respond differently to your programs. They're going to hear through a different set of lenses, and I think and have a different set of metrics to some degree. So I go back to maybe Clay, where you kind of tease me out on transparency. Part of how you describe and explain your program is super helpful. I also think is how you describe what off-ramps or handholds are within the organization are helpful. And you think through that as the way you communicate it. And a little sarcasm from the Marine here. That's why, the Army uses comic books. Sorry, had to get that in there.
So I'd like to add too, actually, we were all early in our career at some point, right? And, we've been doing this stuff for a while now. I remember early in my career, I got involved in some working groups, again, with the IC, working across the community and going to these things. And I was mid-20s getting involved in these things with these, veterans that have been doing this for 30, 40 years. And I got into conversations, to your point, Liza, where I would say, hey, technology-wise, people are probably going to do this. And I had, someone say, well, I've been doing investigations for 40 years, and that's not how it's done. And frankly, it had a morale impact for me where it's like, well, I guess you just don't want to hear what I have to say. And so as I've worked in programs, and I think it's important for programs to remember that just because you don't understand a generation, or just because you don't understand somebody who likes to game or likes to have a lot of tattoos or doesn't want to wear a suit, doesn't mean they don't have something important to say. And I think it's worth taking what everyone has to say and listening when you're building your program, when you're reacting to things. And I've definitely had more junior analysts bring a thing to me that I didn't understand. And I'm like, wait, people do that? And they're like, yeah. And I'm like, okay, well, what do we need to do? How do we protect them and us from this behavior? So I think that's very important to not make any cross section feel marginalized because I've never done that thing.
Exactly. No, those are great points. Yeah, this is an awesome. I think we could do an hour just on this topic alone. To be honest, yeah, exactly. No, it's been really. I'm learning a lot just from the whole conversation here. I think Clay, I think you were going to take the next one.
I we've touched on a little bit, but again, the kind of going back to culture, trust, a lot of folks are working on monitoring programs, and we've talked about the balance of privacy and monitoring, and I think another way to kind of build that trust is that notion of watching the watcher, and how do you instill in, with great power comes great responsibility. There's a difference between, like you said, managing and leading. As we're using these programs, I've definitely seen situations where someone involved in the monitoring program turned out to be a not great person, and it was a situation we had to deal with. I'd like to hear any thoughts on kind of balancing all the monitoring, privacy, and all that with, hey, we're not just carte blanche looking at whatever we want. Yeah, I'd appreciate any thoughts on that.
Doc, I'll go first on that. And I'm going to go kind of structural, Lee. I think when you build out an insider threat program, usually it's not one tool. People keep, I need this tool to solve this riddle. Tools are a critical component of that, but then it's what you do from the risk discovery. And this will back into the idea of who's operating. You need to have two-factor in whatever you're doing. If you're using a lot of AI and some of this new generative AI, you still have to have forcing functions where humans actually engage. And ideally, when you build in an insider threat program, your workflow is auditable. You should have the ability to audit that. That audit should be done on a regular basis, kind of like a red teaming of it. Is it still the most current to keep us safe? And then on the other side of that, from the legal, does it still meet all the legal requirements? I mean, I go back to California and their Senate Bill 553, which is about workplace violence. Does your program comport with some of the changes in that? So this idea of constantly reviewing what you're doing and iterating to bring in new capability and new technology to align with the changing risk vectors is super important. But to the watcher comment, I think that has to be built into your workflow, the ability to have that audit function, the ability to have a way to look at the EEOC requirements about how did I take bias and favoritism out. So not only is the bad potentially the person in the system with the master controls, potentially you're a bad actor, is it the system is set up to make sure there's no bias or favoritism, so you don't wield the system then as a weapon. Right. So I think those are important because, especially in the conversations that are playing out, all around us these days, you want that level of systematic function that has built in those control measures. 1, 2, just to surmise, then you need an audit functionality where you look to ensure that it is still addressing the risk surfaces. Specifically, Clay, you said as an organization grows, does your systems grow with that? Can it scale? And then the last part of that is you have that way in that audit trail to ensure that the individuals that have that access is controlled and logged. And then at the end of that, whatever the byproduct of your program is, that accountability, there's a separate group then that looks at that wasn't involved necessarily in the whole process, that fresh set of eyes to go. And this goes, I think, all back where we started. This goes back to the idea of culture and trust. That at the very end of this, another set of eyes, before the final adjudication is made, before judgment is rendered, right? That mitigation hasn't been able to happen. We're now in an adjudicative model that level of adjudication has the right level of oversight. And then to close the circle is shared in some way back into the organization, back to your point, Clay, of walking someone out. That's kind of, I would think about it, that's kind of my structural engineer approach.
We're not hearing you, Dr. Briggs.
We can see your lips are moving.
I don't know. I didn't touch
There you
any.
go.
There you are.
That's so weird. Maybe I have to speak loudly enough for it to meet threshold. My only additions to what you said, Mike, are just specific points. You should have procedures for what you will do if someone within the group goes that way. What's going to happen? And it should be written and documented so that you have a response, not some reaction, right? You have something clearly written. Your program should always be tied to legal, someone in legal with the expertise who understands technical cyber and also can understand your program, so that if something's not quite right, they're giving you that guidance. The last piece I will say is that working groups are a check and balance system on any sort of insider threat fabric, because they come from different disciplines, they have their ideas, they know what they're doing, they're highly trained professionals, and they can check those things. Someone else might be able to do it if the insider threat program can't, and they should be doing it.
Mhm.
Those three elements, I think, in addition to the audits, and as well as just training for the professionals who are working and given the trust to do the insider threat mission space, should help you if that event arises, and it can happen. So
Yeah, and I'll say that nobody likes writing ConOps and SOPs, right? It's like a dirty word, ConOps SOP, ConOps SOPs. But I've always been a big proponent of clearly documenting costs and everybody involved. What happens, if a team member is doing something bad and you're using some kind of case managed case, right? Or there's not a case on me or whatever, and how to handle that. I wanted to pivot. I appreciate all y'all's time here. I want to pivot and ask one more question. So bringing it back to wellness, right? How do we handle an insider risk programs? It's kind of a multifaceted question. One is, I've literally heard the phrase before from someone, well, we don't want to become the suicide police. And two, I've definitely worked in large environments where, especially like, for example, around holidays, certain, unfortunate events do tend to go up. And I've seen that have a really major impact on the actual analysts, in that they feel like they're missing something, they should have caught something, or even if we're catching it, it can be weighing down on them. And I'd love thoughts on how to handle that in your programs as well.
I worked on a piece for that a while ago. I didn't ever finish it, that looked at and sort of talked about burnout stressors for people who are insider threat professionals. And what was fascinating in my review is how much alike and aligned we are with people who are first responders. And I would say that many of the people in the community, which isn't said, especially in the insider threat risk community, come from communities where they already had a lot of exposure. We draw from FBI and people with backgrounds in law enforcement, counterintelligence folks, intelligence people who have been seeing and exposed to information for years, sometimes very horrible, damaging, hurtful information. And they carry all of that in their spirit and they use it as part of their skill set for the job. I believe we need to do more in terms of looking after our people. It's not enough to say, oh, we have a behavioral scientist who kind of talks to us and around us about these things. But no, I mean, true grief and loss kind of interventions that deal with that, not just in the workforce if there's some affected thing, but also for professionals. And I also, in my research, saw that it's different levels. If you're a supervisor or senior leader, or if you're an analyst, or if you're a behavioral scientist, you have a different interface with information, different responsibilities, and responses need to be considered. We need to start professionalizing that as part of what we do as check-ins for our people, and we're not there yet. And now you're making me want to pick up the research and kind of pull that together, because that would be a good presentation to sort of show what I found about that, because it's different. With the senior levels, they have to keep the straight face and hold on to a lot of things. Meanwhile, they're often fighting for money, budgets, trying to keep the program alive, and they don't feel necessarily that they can share that with anyone. So they're isolated, and it's sort of considered that's what leadership is, and there's still people behind leaders. And so to keep people good leaders, we have to attend to that. Analysts every day in, day out, looking for material. If you're on systems like a UAM type capability, you're clearing things and learning about folks' lives. And oftentimes the things that are triggered are negative things that aren't going well for them. And so how do you check in with your analysts? And are you checking in with them periodically for that? The behavioral scientists, folks who are doing case management and trying to look at mental health illnesses and watching people not at their best. just because they have degrees and background in clinical areas doesn't mean that they're not effective. Most of them professionally get help and assistance as part of what they do as professionals. But we should be tying this together and sort of looking at that more deeply. And you raised a really good point and a good question about that. I think we can do more in that area.
Yeah, and I know we're short on time. I'll go real fast because I echo what Dr. Briggs. So I'm going to pull something out that I thought was super important and as a tool. When Dr. Briggs talks about check-ins, I think check-ins, back to the idea of being aware of your workforce as that shock absorber, is a super important tool. I've seen meetings that start with check-ins, and we sometimes do those informally, where like even on this call, as we're all getting ready to start, hey, how are you doing today? What's going on? What are your plans for this weekend? That is some degree is an informal check-in, but it's that idea of connecting. So to the suicide stuff, the work we do around suicide prevention, connecting this is a great antibody. And that ability that it's sincere, it's not pro forma, is obviously better, but even just having that conversation. And I'll go back to this idea of whether it's the critical pathway to violence, you look at waiver 21, and these structured professional judgment tools, they all tell you don't start on a Monday to do that bad thing. Suicide is a tragic outcome for sure. But if I was saying this to insider risk professionals, hey, we got someone, they got some financial issues, looks like they got a DUI last night, they got an open court case, and it looks like they're going through a divorce. The insider threat person would be like, ooh, we better make sure that person's privileges, we do some, that's the same leading indicator someone's going to die by suicide. So it might have nothing to do with what they do in the workspace, might have everything to do with within their work. So this idea of that check-in, that early check-in, I think a good insider risk program has a significant mitigation capability set to mitigate with a focus on retention, back to retaining good people. That should be clearly communicated. And it needs to have a small adjudicative investigative side when the clear lines are crossed. But I think we miss so many early opportunities in their pathway to engage, and not to say I'm the suicide prevention police, but just a wellness. Hey, this individual is struggling. And I would tell if you had an HR professional on this call and I asked them, hey, is it better to hire and fire or is the hire retain? They would, without a doubt, hire retain. Significantly cheaper cost-wise, or operationally, you can maintain a high quality player on your team and you message across the organization back to this idea of organizational trust. So I'm in that, to doctor, I really like that check-in. I think that is an important tool that should be used by all levels of leadership.
100% agree. Yeah, these are awesome talking points here for sure. I really like that also. And it was a good question, right, about the check-ins, checking in with the analyst, to Clay's point, and what Liza said there, like checking in with those analysts that are seeing this and getting in that mud and seeing all that stuff that's going on there could be pretty tough to deal with, right? So that's those check-ins for those people that are looking at the stuff daily is a great point as well.
Yeah, thanks so much, Mike, Liza. Thanks so much for joining Shibu and me. We had a great time. Again, I think each of these topics we could probably turn into a long, dissertation about it. So this has been so much fun. I really appreciate your time, and everyone, keep an eye out for additional content coming from Everfox in the near future. Here, we got a few things coming, and again, thanks so much for joining, and everyone have a good day.
Awesome, appreciate the opportunity.